During the COVID-19 pandemic, Asian Americans have increasingly been the target of hate crimes. Many say the assaults, vandalism, and verbal abuse are being fueled by xenophobic rhetoric about the coronavirus. In recent weeks, a surge in attacks has gained national attention. With so much of Hawaii's population comprised of Asian Americans, we'll discuss the rise in violence and the Stop Asian Hate movement. Tonight's live broadcast and live stream of insights on PBS Hawaii start now.
Aloha, and welcome to Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Daryl Huff. Hate crimes against Asian Americans have been on the rise since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. According to the organization Stop Asian American Pacific Islander Hate, between March of 2020 and February of this year, there were nearly 3,800 racial incidents reported to its center. The types of discrimination include physical assault, verbal harassment, and civil rights violations. Even in Hawaii, where a large portion of our population is comprised of Asian Americans, many say racism needs to be addressed. Our panel tonight will discuss the rise of the anti-Asian sentiment. We look forward to your participation in tonight's show. You can email, call, or tweet your questions, and you'll find a live stream of this program at pbshawaii.org and the PBS Hawaii Facebook page. Now to our guests. U.S. Senator Mazie Hirono was elected to Congress in 2006. She served in the U.S. House before being elected to the Senate in 2012. She is Hawaii's first female U.S. Senator and is the country's first Asian American female senator. Born in Japan, her mother brought her and her siblings to Hawaii for a better life. Amy Agbayani is the co-chair of the Hawaii Friends of Civil Rights. An immigrant from the Philippines, she came to Hawaii to study at the East-West Center. She has dedicated her life to fighting for civil rights, social justice, and improving access for higher education for underrepresented groups. Liann Ebesugawa is the state's Hawaii Civil Rights Commission chair. The agency is comprised of 5 volunteer commissioners. It investigates and enforces state laws prohibiting discrimination related to employment, housing, public accommodations, and access to state services. Trisha Nakamura is a board member of the Japanese American Citizens League Honolulu chapter and is a past president. She works as the Director of Career Services at the William S. Richardson School of Law and was previously a Deputy Public Defender. And Brian Chung is an Associate Professor of Ethnic Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. His research and teachings focused on Asian American and urban studies. He's also developing a project that explores the politics of the 19th and 20th century histories of Chinese settlement in Hawaii. Now, all of you can bring to this something personal, and I appreciate this. And I'll start with you, Senator, but I'd like to go around our panel. Can you tell me a personal story that you've experienced that will help people understand how important this is, particularly people who live in Hawaii?
For one thing, we're very fortunate that in Hawaii we have such a diverse cultural mix that we do appreciate and celebrate the other cultures. I think that is really terrific. But that is not the case in much of the rest of the country. And I would say that each of us, particularly if we've traveled to the mainland, have experienced some xenophobic and anti-Asian kinds of sentiments. I get that. I get quite a lot of emails and various messages left, calling me Tokyo Rose or commenting on the largeness of my eyes and things like that. So yeah, there are also misogynistic comments left for me here. As I said, I would say the most has been, and people tend to keep those kinds of racist thoughts to themselves, I say, but I've been yelled to go back where I came from. And this is why this is a national issue. And finally, with COVID and the rise of hate crimes against Asians, that it is getting the kind of attention and commitment to prevent and prosecute that it deserves.
Liann Ebesugawa from the Civil Rights Commission, can you tell us what personal perspective you bring, what personal experience you may have had that could help people understand why we're talking about this?
Sure. So like the senator, I am from Hawaii, and so we are very, very fortunate not to have that same threat on a day-to-day basis, but that's not so true of our friends and family. I've gone to school on the U.S. continent and refused service at a restaurant, but I think that what's really important for us here in Hawaii is to realize that other folks are also discriminated against in Hawaii, and they may not be all Asians. And that's something that I would like us to examine, and I try to look at it for myself on a day-to-day basis, you know, my work and the places that I go, is who's not included and who's not being represented, and how are there impediments to their access.
You know, Amy Agbayani, in particular, my impression is that Filipinos in Hawaii are still enduring a fair amount of discrimination. What is it you'd like to say about that? And I know you've had a long history here, campaigned for a lot of reforms, but tell me what you'd like to talk about at that point.
Well, Filipinos have been coming to Hawaii for over 115 years, and they first came, you know, and they were valued for their labor and for their brawn and not for their brains. And so there's been a long history of put downs and inequality, you know, as plantation workers. And then more recently, immigrants, since the 1965 immigration law, the majority are Filipino immigrants. And so oftentimes the last group that comes to a particular place is at the bottom. And so Filipino kids, for example, and that's why many of us started Operation Manong to help the immigrant kids that were being bullied when they were coming to school many years ago. But that still happens. I guess our idea is that the good news is that there are a large number of Filipinos. We're the second largest group in the state, but we're extremely underrepresented everywhere in higher education, in leadership positions, and in the media and elsewhere. But it's very interesting because the size makes it very important that people understand that there are groups. The other point I just wanted to make is that many people in Hawaii do not understand or use the term Asian Americans. We're much more comfortable talking about the various individual ethnic groups that make up that category and the Pacific Island category. So, but we are Asian American as a category in the nation. And obviously I've been on the continent. They don't know which, you know.
They don't really know the difference. Brian, okay. Let me give Brian Chung from UH Manoa Ethnic Studies Program. What perspective would you like to share about your personal experience and help people relate to what's going on with this movement?
I think one of the things that's resonated with me the most with regards to the conversations that are happening is how so many different Asian Americans of different generations and different immigration experiences are, you know, speaking out or recognizing in a different way, I think, their experiences with racism in the United States. And I think, you know, speaking with my own parents or just hearing about other people speaking with their family members about this, you know, this feels like a moment in which, you know, I think that there could be a larger conversation about Asian Americans about the presence of racism in their personal experiences, but also collective experiences. And I think one of the other things that's been really amazing and incredible is thinking about how Asian Americans can relate their own experiences with other different racialized minorities in the United States. And so I think the kind of relational and comparative analyses that we're seeing amongst Asian Americans and other communities of color is really hopeful and inspiring. And I think that those conversations just need to are still happening. And that's really amazing for me.
Yeah, the conversations that are happening are unlike anything I've heard before around the Asian American experience. Trisha Nakamura from the Japanese American Citizens League, what would you like to say on that point of, you know, your own personal perspective and how it fits in with this conversation?
Yeah, this is an interesting topic to think about because it really brings up the complexities and intersectionalities of identity that we all bring to the table, especially here in Hawaii, right? Because Daryl, as you mentioned, and I really want to commend PBS for bringing up this topic in Hawaii because it is an uncomfortable one perhaps to have. Because often from the Japanese American perspective, right, we come from a place of privilege in Hawaii often. And as an Asian settler here who's benefited from my ancestors who had a choice to come here to work on the plantations, right? And I happen to be Okinawan and I've kind of inherited their history of changing our last name to sound more Japanese because for my Okinawan, you know, great-grandparents, it was it was better to perhaps be Japanese, right? So I've inherited that, right? My uncle who served in the 442nd and his family who didn't talk about their experiences in World War II or after that because of the fear that they felt and shame, right? I've inherited that. And when and as I kind of think about my role in this, one of the things that drew me into the JACO was their willingness to take on the efforts, but also work as an ally on behalf of other communities using their privilege, right? Passing legislation or resolutions with our national organization to support the indigenous rights of Native Hawaiians for self-determination, for example, and being one of the first groups to come out in support of same-sex marriage, which I know Amy worked a ton on and had support from Senator Hirono. So all of these collective efforts are really important because this is about racism and also about the fear and hate that come with difference. And it's a really timely topic.
We're already starting to get some questions from viewers, and I'd like them to drive this conversation as much as possible. Jade from Nu'uanu, and let me start with Liann Ebesugawa from the Civil Rights Commission on this. Racism is so subtle in Hawaii. What are the signs we should look for? That's a really interesting, nuanced question. Liann, what do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I think you know it, right? If you are the person that is the victim of that, you'll feel it. I also think, though, that there is very pervasive ways that racism works within our communities, within our business communities, within our government institutions. And that starts really with folks having good employment practices, ensuring that, none of their predispositions to bias or prejudice come into these kinds of decisions. And how do we make sure that we're getting to a place where everybody can be elevated? Otherwise, we will never, ever find a sustaining and enduring state of feeling safe. I think it's just going to be one group or the next group or the next.
Amy, Agbayani wanted to say something about that?
Yes. One of the very subtle but problematic problems we face is actually accent discrimination against people who have an accent. And if you're a grown-up immigrant, you probably will have an accent that's not acceptable. And so we've had cases. In fact, the one that helped us lobby for the Civil Rights Commission was the case called Fragante. He came in number one in a written civil service test out of over 700 people, and then they're supposed to interview them, and he was never selected because of his accent. So we brought Bill Hoshijo and others brought the case to court. We didn't win, but we did make a number of people understand that this subtle discrimination just puts down and treats people unequally, and it's discriminatory.
And understanding is sometimes a victory in and of itself, I would say. Senator Hirono, what's your thoughts about that? I mean, you grew up from a little girl as an immigrant child. How old were you when you came?
Almost 8.
I was 8. So you were conscious of just anti-immigrant sentiment and so on. So
there's also discrimination against people who are poor. So there's no place that is free of various kinds of discriminatory attitudes, whether they be gender-based, race-based, on our accents, whatever. So we have to be ever vigilant at all times. This is why we have the Civil Rights Commission. This is why we have other organizations in Hawaii to make sure that the kinds of things that we should be paying attention to in Hawaii are addressed. And of course, what's happening nationally, though, and this is something that Brian brought out, is that now finally, I've never seen so many Asian faces on national TV as now. And I say it is about time that our nation recognize that racism is never far below the surface in our country, whether it be the kind of overt racism against the Chinese, against the Japanese, against the Muslims. You have all of these other groups that are deemed other, and we definitely, AAPIs are always viewed as the other. And so never far below the surface, and we have to be ever vigilant. But this is, as Brian says, I think it's a confluence of attention being paid, and I see a lot of AAPI people raising their voices and standing up and recognizing that when we stand up for ourselves, we are standing for other marginalized groups too. And so that part of what's happening with the recognition, of course, first we have to recognize, and then we have to do something about it to prevent it.
I just
so that's kind of what's on our agenda, I would say.
I think that one thing that's interesting about those of us who've lived here for a long time, you develop sort of a thick skin after a while, where you may not be not seeing these subtle signs because you're not. But I'm curious, Brian and Trisha, younger folks, it seems like the younger generations are way more sensitive to this than we were. And I'd be curious, Brian, as a younger person, do you see the signs of racism, perhaps that your parents or your grandparents didn't see?
Yeah. Well, maybe I could use my students as an example because they're a lot younger than me. And so
you look young. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Just on the outside, maybe. But I think what's really interesting in light of the recent events and attacks on the violence against Asians that's happening across the continent is that, a lot of my students are really aware and paying attention to these issues. And not just these issues, but other issues that are happening with Black Lives Matter, as well as other events that are happening. And so I think that's what's really, inspiring, and I know I keep using that word, I think is that they're really changing the conversations and the discourses. And I think the things that I grew up in, like, the 80s and 90s, thinking that was really progressive, looking back on that now, is not something that I think people would condone, and I wouldn't do that myself. And so, I think what we're seeing is that, with every generation, that there's going to be a transformation in how we think about these things, and a sort of revisiting and revising what we know of the past. And I think these generation of young people that I've been in contact with seem like they're really thinking about these things and really motivated to be a part of this social movements in any way that they can, culturally or politically.
And speaking out as well. And Trisha Nakamura from JACL, in your role as a law school employee, you see this younger generation coming through too. But I'm curious though, are there signs that they're seeing or that you're seeing that those of us who are maybe older aren't going to see?
No, I think everyone experiences racism and sees discrimination happen. I think the ways that people interpret things or address them differ, right? And I think what's really exciting now is with more visibility, right? Whether it be awareness from the George Floyd murder and people refusing to stand by that. And, the rise of social media and all the different movements that are going on, right? It's not new that people were allies for one another, right? Like when you think of Malcolm X, right? Yuri Kochiyama was always by his side. And when you think of other movements, right, we always need to rely on our partners and our allies. But when I look at the law students today, what's really exciting about it, and also the young people who, take part in our national JACL efforts, it's really exciting to see that they're not willing to stay silent or refusing to make waves, right? They aren't afraid of making waves, because if it's not addressed, it's just gonna fester like a wound, right? And we know that. We experience it today in different ways. So it's really exciting to see people fearless and fighting interesting ways to address these issues so that it doesn't get to the next generation, right? I would hate for us to be in the same place, because it looks like we're going backwards, right? With what happened at our nation's capital and how dangerous, right? It could be in a flash that we lose our democracy and what we stand for, right? It could just happen if we're not vigilant. And
Yes.
when the testimony with the young people, right, testifying in the Chauvin case, it's heartbreaking to feel like that they are apologizing to George Floyd every night, right? I'm listening to the NPR stories of their testimony. It's heartbreaking. So I'm inspired and excited that students aren't willing to just stay silent so that these harms continue.
So again, back to our viewer questions. We were talking a little bit about this. This one brings up two issues, both about the language, people getting teased or discriminated against because of their accents, but also the political class here. The question is from Kevin and Kaimuki: why haven't more politicians expressed outrage at Kauai police chief and his demeaning of Asian Americans? We know what he's accused of doing, which is basically to mimic a heavy accent of an Asian person. I'm curious, is any one of you wants to jump in on this? Maybe Liann Ebesugawa. In the workplace, we have there's a tendency to very easily slip into the humor, that just funny. This is just funny. We tease each other guy's race. Is that still okay?
I don't think that it's okay. I think that we have to elevate our sensitivity to other people, we never know sort of what condition they are in and the experiences they've had in their life. So I'm not saying you be hypersensitive and you don't talk to your coworkers and you don't engage and you don't become bonded as a workforce. But I think we have to be sensitive, and we have to talk to each other, right? So rather than assuming something, you can ask, right? And you can find out what is their history, and not saying like, where did you come from, right? But in terms of like just getting to know each other. So yes, I do think that we really need to up our game in terms of being sensitive to each other, even in Hawaii, where we have what is perceived as very good race relations. We don't really. I mean, there is an undercurrent of a lot of discord and a lot of unfairness, and that's the things that we need to bring to the surface.
Senator Hirono, I was thinking again about, after living in Hawaii and then being in Washington, what lessons have you learned from your experience on the mainland that perhaps inform you about what Hawaii needs to be careful about or look to?
Hawaii shouldn't be complacent about discrimination that occurs in Hawaii. And as I said, it can take many forms. And the ethnic background is only just one of those kinds of discrimination. So no place is free of that. And while we're focusing on the hate crimes against Asian Americans, yes, we have discrimination in Hawaii. So when I go to the mainland, though, it's so much more overt. And when you see that these horrific examples of that 65-year-old woman being beaten and the people in a shop, I suppose, standing by, we really need to raise not just the awareness, but our ability to respond in an appropriate way to help. And so we've seen too many examples of APIA women and seniors being knocked down and nobody comes to help. What is with that, right? That is not our country. We better just wake up to the sense of responsibility and care that we have for our fellow human beings. And maybe, more of that happens in Hawaii, for which I'm grateful. But I see the kind of overt racism so much more in DC. And that's why whenever I have a chance to be on news shows, I say, I'm very grateful that in Hawaii, aloha and ohana are not just words to us, it's how we aspire to live, to be kind to each other and to care for each other.
Let me ask, though, just as a politician, I want to honor this question about the Kauai police chief, because I just got a second one. As a politician in Hawaii, is it difficult to call out these stereotypes? And do politicians in Hawaii, are they willing to call people out on this? Or is it tend to be sort of a keep your head down and don't step into that, the racism issue in Hawaii?
Well, maybe some of Amy or some of the other panelists can respond to that. I think we come from a culture that is not terribly confrontational or terribly verbal. And so we're getting to the point where I see more and more people, especially the young people, speaking out, and not in an obnoxious way, because we need to speak up and stand up. That's something that I personally have had a whole journey in overcoming, because Hawaii is a very, we were very ohana and all of that. But yes, we do need to say that's not okay.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that, or whether you'd like to see more outrage expressed in Hawaii over issues like that? How about Trisha? What do you think?
you know, it's definitely something that, you know, the actions by the Kauai police chief are scary ones, right? Because they bring up things where you have someone who represents law enforcement and a really important role, because we as community want to trust law enforcement. And when we put when that gets challenged, it's a very dangerous place for our society to be in. And I think, you know, coming from the Asian American perspective, perhaps, or just maybe the Japanese American perspective, you know, incidents, even if it's just a gesture or a comment, right? It's based in racism or discrimination, and that's not something that should be warranted in the workplace. So it's very, you know, it gives us pause to think about that, right, and what it means and what we're willing to stand for, and demand of our leadership. Because at the end of the day, right, whether it be a comment or an act of violence, it stems from fear, perhaps ignorance, and it's important for us to be able to have these conversations, because if we don't learn to get along, we're all going to live together, right? There's racism, unfortunately, discrimination are always going to exist. So we need to learn how to work as a society so that we can have dialogue and discourse, so that it doesn't lead to acts of violence.
Okay, I'm going to ask you. Sorry to interrupt you. I have another question here that I think you folks will want to respond to, almost the form of the question as well as the general issue that it brings up. Jim in Hawaii Kai asks, is there more discrimination locally against Asians or Caucasians? Brian, could you mind trying to take that on? That's a very difficult, Brian Chung of UH Ethnic Studies.
Sure.
What do you think of that question?
I think that this is something that comes up a lot in my classroom conversations, particularly in my introductory courses when we begin to introduce concepts such as like race, ethnicity, racism, discrimination. And I think that there is this there's a very kind of prominent conversation of that white people in Hawaii are discriminated against, whether through interpersonal relationships or bullying, and things of that kind of nature. And I think that those are examples of prejudice, but I don't know if those are necessarily examples of racism, because I think racism is, at least how some folks would define it, is related to more structural inequalities as related to things like wealth, employment, housing, so on and so forth. And I think that some of these things that we're sort of seeing are also more about interpersonal in nature. And I'm not saying that those things aren't hurtful, but I think that I wouldn't qualify it as racism, but I do definitely think that it does reflect larger issues about race and social privileges that we might see exhibited throughout different sort of societies and communities.
Let me ask Liann Ebesugawa from the Hawaii Civil Rights Commission. Brian brought this up. There's a difference between legal discrimination and sort of social stuff. How big a problem is discrimination against Caucasians from what you've seen at the Civil Rights Commission? Do you get cases like that?
Yeah, I think that either way, right? Even in hate crimes, if you are white or Caucasian, you can still bring a claim, right? Because it's based on an immutable characteristic. I think what Brian's talking about is sort of the historical and institutional framework of how non-whites have been systematically excluded from the mainstream. And I think that is where the racism comes in, from the various laws that were enacted, the Chinese Exclusion Act, to ordinances that prohibit sale of lands to non-whites, and even in Hawaii, right, that was true in the Kahala, Hawaii Kai areas, and so there is that institution of white supremacy, but I think that everybody should feel safe and protected wherever they are, and so that is sort of the underlying premise that we work from in a non-discrimination law perspective, right?
Okay, so we've talked quite a bit about Hawaii and what's happening in Hawaii. I think that we need to turn to the national scene right now. And you know, how much do you folks think that this anti-Asian hate, violence being expressed is due to President Trump and his statements, you know, calling coronavirus the Kung flu and the China virus and so on? Do you think that he really did provoke people into violence in that area? Amy Agbayani, can you take a look at that question?
Yes, there are lots of polls actually that asked Asian Americans if they felt uh, discriminated against, particularly during the COVID period. And like 75% felt that Asian Americans were discriminated against during COVID, and that a huge number of them, people of color particularly, were infected in greater numbers and died in greater numbers. And I think it was many things, but definitely President Trump talking about the China virus and Kung flu just normalized it and made it okay to have a scapegoat. And so I don't. He definitely made things worse. And what we had to do is call it what it was. It was a very racist statement that did not assist the nation from actually healing or reaching out to these communities. One of the things that people have to understand is that particularly Asian Americans did get infected in great numbers, but they were also represented a lot of the caregivers.
Oh, yes.
I just know a little bit about Filipino data. Filipino nurses are 4% of the of nurses are Filipino, but 30% of the nurses that died were Filipino. So we have a lot of Asian Americans actually in the front line, essential workers. And then you get this president saying, duh, you know, you caused it. And then people think it's okay to discriminate.
Go ahead, Senator.
Trump really created an environment where a lot of what I would call the incipient targeting of the other, that would be us, came to the fore. And so it makes a difference that the leaders condemning this kind of targeted random attacks on a community, API community. And it makes a difference when we now have a president who not only acknowledges that this is horrible and we ought to do something about it, has taken some initiatives to address the concerns and the problems and to stop it and to do something very positive about addressing the issue. And this president has, in my view, elevated this discussion in the way that it should be. But it should not be just about the hatred and targeting of APIs, because our country targets other people way too often. And so we need to be very keenly aware that today might be APIs, tomorrow it be, well, the Muslims have already been targeted. But, you know, one of the things that, but while we say that, it's really reassuring and positive that a lot of the young people are speaking out, and yet we hear stories of, for example, in elementary school, an Asian kid being beaten up by others because of being Asian. You know, racism is taught. And so when I'm asked, what are you going to do about it? You can prosecute these people, but I do think that our education system, we need to really look at what kind of stereotypes are being perpetrated through our schools.
Brian Chung, can you describe to me why it's truth to make a connection between, say, the words of a president about a virus to someone actually attacking and beating up somebody? What is the path of that electricity that goes and creates that happening?
I think when there are particular government officials who have a certain type of power, and in this case, it's political power and maybe other forms of power, and when somebody when somebody like that is able to repeat the same kinds of phrases and rhetoric over and over again, in some ways that specific phrasing or ideas can be seen as truth as it gets circulated through different kinds of media. I would say regardless of the types of other forms of media or other discourses out there. And so I think something that we've seen historically is the role when it comes to anti-Asian racism or anti-Asian violence is the role of government officials or the role of media who, working in relationship to politics, producing this wider discourse that circulates nationally, locally, regionally, so on and so forth. So, I think the playbook that we're sort of seeing here is something that we've seen over the course of the 20th and 19th century, where the voices of particular, powerful political figures, permeates through other forms of, transmits through other kinds of institutions such as education, media, television, so on and so forth.
You bring up the history, and I think that one of the things that's happened during this period of time is a lot of unknown history is being raised and pointing out that this is not a new thing. This has been going on for quite a long time. Many of you have been making that point. But getting back to this question about when politicians or leaders talk in this way, it can lead institutions to make decisions too, as well. Trisha Nakamura from Japanese American Citizens League. I mean, what kind of examples come to your mind when you think about people are making actively racist statements, but then things then happen, big things happen?
I mean, clearly, right, you look at the internment, right, the incarceration of Japanese Americans and Japanese people and other ethnic groups who were enemies of the United States during World War II, massively round up just purely on the basis of what they look like or where they were from, who their ancestors were, without any convictions, without any basis, without their civil rights and their constitutional rights in place. And when you think about that, right, it's often forgotten that that happened to us here in Hawaii too. There are different estimates, but more than 2,000 people in Hawaii were sent to incarceration centers throughout the US continent, taken away from their families, left behind, not knowing where they were going, simply on the basis of government sanctioned fear, right? Unwarranted government sanctioned fear. And I think that there are many parallels to what we're seeing, right? We saw that with the Muslim bans. There were multiple times, and thankfully JACO was able to come in and submit amicus briefs contesting those, right? Because it's like history is repeating itself over and over again. And part of our role as JACL is to make sure, right, we have the legacy of making sure this doesn't happen again, right? With all the efforts, with what happened, and the apologies that came through redress, that was a really hard fought effort to get redress. It would be for naught should this continue to happen. And we are seeing it happen. We're going backwards, and it's a really scary time. So we need to keep having these conversations because it is so quick to draw on the ongoing hate, right, or difference that someone might have and make them the next target or scapegoat them, right? Because someone doesn't want to deal with a public health crisis. So I'm going to make it the other person's fault. Someone who doesn't look like me, someone who may not have political power. I'm going to make it the Chinese American or the Chinese community's fault or China's fault. So naturally that translates to most East Asians. So it's going to just broaden and and that reminds me of Vincent Chin also, right? So there are numerous examples throughout history of how this plays out.
Okay, I want to, Liann Ebesugawa from the Civil Rights Commission. We're getting some technical questions. Is there a difference between a racial attack versus a regular assault? Will someone serve more time, and how is that determined? I mean, are the laws that we have focused at all on the racial versus just a regular assault? And I'm thinking of the assault case on Maui, I think it was Maui, where a Caucasian man was beaten. The treatment of the local courts was very much oh, this is just, a regular assault. The men got probation, but then they got charged with hate crimes by the federal government. So I'm wondering, is there enough in the law to crack down and actually deter this kind of crime?
Yeah. So, Daryl, the commission is focused on non-discrimination laws, and so we don't manage and prosecute cases of assault or any physical harm in that way. But what I do know of hate crime legislation, right, is that there are elevated penalties when it is a hate crime. And so I think that what that means is that's a fantastic way to address issues, but it needs to be coupled with a number of other things, including how do we get these statistics about education in the police force, in other social services as well. So you can have a law, but you need to have the supports in order for it to be effective. And I think Trisha, as a former public defender, might be able to maybe add a little bit more color in that regard.
Yeah, Trisha, very briefly, can you just give me a sense? It seems that it's very rarely charged in Hawaii.
Well, I'm not sure what the stats are in particular, but often the studies that I've read as a law student, and obviously I'm interested in criminal matters, but I often think about this, right? When you need to seek the law to remedy an issue, the harm has already occurred generally. So I like Senator Hirono's point about the need for education, because once a crime has happened, once that woman in San Francisco, once that auntie was beaten up, her life and her children's life and that community is impacted, right? I mean, I'm impacted by it, right? Not even knowing her. And that harm has occurred. And, prosecuting the person who committed that offense is not going to make this woman whole. It's not necessarily going to make her feel safer again.
Amy sorry, Trisha. Amy Agbayani, do you feel like there are laws in place that can actually change people's behavior, or is it something bigger that we need to go through to change people's behavior?
It's a lot bigger, and that's why we have laws, but we also need to have schools that and parents and ourselves. What we have to do is somehow, as a culture, as a community, be intentionally anti-racist, be intentionally inclusive, and so I think this is a special time for Asian Americans because there is a focus. Usually, it's seen as a black and white USA, America, and actually there are other groups within that mix that are oftentimes they're invisible. That's what Asian Americans have said. What we need is visibility and voice. And that's what we do. And by the way, we oftentimes think that our, Asian women are quiet and they complain. And then I always remember Patsy Mink and A.Q. McElrath and now Mazie, that we need to use our voice. And I think by the way, a lot of this is because of the growth of the Asian American community in the United States. It's 6%, but the fastest growing ethnic group in the entire country. And in Georgia, the voters increased by 140%. Asian Americans increased compared to something like 10% of the white votes. So that it's becoming a significant group that cannot be ignored. And this is the time for all the Asian communities. And the other thing is the other ethnic groups are paying attention and actually reaching out, and we're supporting each other. Asian Americans stood up and participated in Black Lives Matters. But before that, very many Asian Americans would not have.
Okay, I mean, I need to give Senator Hirono would like to say something. And I want to just point out one caller came in and said, I noticed the absence of Korean Americans in the panel, which reflects much of the daily experience here as well. They often remain invisible. This sense, particularly in Hawaii's melting pot of certain ethnic groups not getting their attention or fairness. Senator, I'll let you say what you want to say, but I'd also like to ask, what does it mean to you to see this movement that's happening now? That the huge rally we had a huge rally here, bigger than many of the rallies I've seen before around this issue at the state capitol. Is this an exciting time? As harrowing as it is it an exciting time for Asian Americans?
It is a growing awareness time, and with awareness must come action. Not every state has anti-hate crime legislation. At the federal level, we have the Matthew Shepard hate crimes law, but you can have the law, but unless it's being implemented and used, which means that we need to have police departments that even understand when a crime might be a hate crime. Case in point, the Atlanta situation. And it's just amazing that you have this police spokesperson basically allowing the perpetrator to narrate what motivated him. That is crazy, and that's why, one of the first bills that the Democrats are going to place on the Senate floor when we return in a week is the COVID hate crimes bill. And you would think that this is a totally non-controversial bill in my view. All it asks is for the Attorney General's office to designate one person to review hate crimes that are occurring, to work with state and local law enforcement and community groups to better get the word out in appropriate cultural and language so that we can actually get data on the extent of hate crimes. This is, to me, a totally non-controversial bill. Do you think a single Republican has signed on to the bill? No. It is not as though we have not made overtures. This is what we're up against. So we do need to, the growing awareness is good, but we have to stay the course, which means that we not only have to enact legislation, we have to make some changes to what kids learn about other cultures, and then we need to enforce and educate law enforcement to do their jobs.
In addition to the Korean American mention here, and the Caucasian mention earlier, a caller, Hawaiians are still being abused in Hawaii, their homeland, from the time of the illegal overthrow. Is this kind of, in some ways, a risky conversation to have? That when we start talking about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and we're not talking about another group, that there's a chance that we're going to create division. Brian Chung, what do you think? How should these conversations take place and not offend the person who's not being talked about?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I think I've been looking to some of the work that's being done already, I think in different communities across the United States. I mean, we see advocacy groups or ad hoc community-based programs, which are finding ways in which this issue becomes a more collective conversation and sense of accountability that one has to one's own community. And so I think some of the things that we're seeing, I think one of the things that's been talked about a lot are these chaperone programs that we see in places like Oakland or New York City or Chicago, where you hear about not just Asians, but Asians and other folks in those communities, whether Latinx, African American, so on and so forth, white, that they're helping to kind of chaperone an elderly Asian person from one place to another. And I think what's interesting to point out is the language of that is that this isn't about patrols, where patrols is more about, finding, this more sort of policing kind of aspect, but using the word chaperone is more about this notion about community accountability and how does the whole community come out to be accountable to these people that are part of their lives. So I think that these types of things that I've been sort of noticing, also things such as bystander trainings, which I think are really important if you are somebody who is witnessing something.
Yes.
I think these are other ways of which people can get involved and to have a different sort of relationship to what's happening and what they're witnessing. Because I believe it's probably very scary and probably very tense to witness something, but I think these trainings can be a really great opportunity to have somebody feel a sense of empathy or find a way to sort of intervene. and to care for somebody else that could be a complete stranger. So I think that it has the opportunity to open up different conversations that don't get focused simply on the one particular group at hand, but how do we bring other people into this conversation?
Liann, what encourages you about what you're seeing in terms of this movement? It's interesting to me that we had Black Lives Matter and then this, all brought about because of very violent things, but then you see people saying, I want to stand with my brother of another race. Are you seeing that? Is that exciting to you?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's critical to us having a community and a society where everybody can feel safe, right? What I want to say though is this time, and I think this conversation happening in Hawaii is really important because it gives us an opportunity to look at ourselves too, right? And our privilege and what we are able to do here to help. Right? So if you look at the harm that's going on, it's physical, right? There are attacks, there's threats, but it's also economic as well, right? To businesses. So I think that in Hawaii, we can work at it from ourselves in our communities, in making sure that people are included, that we are having these conversations as well. But I think we have to reach out and we have to have these conversations with our counterparts on the U.S. continent and our organizations on the U.S. continent, and for those organizations to reach out to the affected communities and to build relationships. And I think that way we can ensure that people feel safe, that we feel protected, and that everybody does. Because it's not just about Asians, it is really about community.
I'd like to ask, I got a couple of questions about education, and Senator Hirono mentioned this, but is it a school thing? Amy Agbayani, is it the schools that need to teach this, or is this a conversation should be more appropriate for families and friends and communities and coworkers? Where should this reform take place?
Well, the answer is everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, when you say that, it means nowhere sometimes. So, the media has to be involved and so forth. But I think all of us look at the educational institution as a place where we may be able to intervene and structure the situation, and where the children are learning good things or bad things. And so, for example, like ethnic studies, which I think is necessary, they have to fight to keep their positions. And I'm thinking, does the math department have to fight as hard? I think ethnic studies may be more important than math. And so we have to understand that the ideas of prejudice and our history, and by the way, ethnic studies theme is Our History, Our Way, is that the perspectives of the victims oftentimes, or the perspectives of the people who are not in power, are generally not included.
Okay,
So,
Amy, I need to stop. I need to hold on for a second. I want to ask a very quick question, and I'm not sure who the best person is to ask about this because I only have time for one or two people. Maybe Liann and Trisha. Frank DeLima jokes. I grew up listening to his jokes. I want to know if these types of jokes are now appropriate. Are racist jokes still appropriate in today's day and age? That's a huge question here. Liann, what do you think? Do you think that we can tell these jokes anymore, or not, or is there a way to tell these jokes?
I grew up in a time where the Frank DeLima jokes, are funny, right? And we laugh, and Rep Replingler, we laugh. But I think they do harm, really. And there's narratives that are perpetuated within our local culture that does real harm to other ethnic groups. And I think that's what we have to be sensitive to when we think about saying a joke, or we try to prioritize community or getting that sense of relationship to how could that possibly not necessarily hurt the person you're talking to, although it can, But everybody else, when you perpetuate those kinds of stereotypes, they do have a very insidious way of disenfranchising many people.
Trisha, I got 30 seconds. I'd like to know your thoughts about that.
I think Liann nailed it on the head, right? It's really subtle things that we pick up on, especially young people, that, and if you don't stop those comments and those sort of embedded racist or stereotypical views and don't question it, it can lead to very dangerous things.
Okay, we have to wrap this up now. I want to say mahalo to all of you in our audience for joining us tonight, and we especially thank our guests, U.S. Senator Mazie Hirono, Civil Rights Advocate Amy Agbayani, Chair of the Hawaii Civil Rights Commission, Liann Ebesugawa, Trisha Nakamura, Board Member of the Japanese American Citizens League Honolulu Chapter, and UH Manoa Ethnic Studies Associate Professor Brian Chung. Next week on Insights, Priced Out of Paradise. It's an ongoing issue with no current effective solution. How can we provide affordable housing for Hawaii residents? We'll hear what ideas are on the table. Please join us then. I'm Daryl Huff for Insights on PBS Hawaii. Aloha.